Bien, nous voici de retour pour la fin de cette matinée où nous allons écouter Jessica ANDRUSS de l'université de Virginie, qui est donc rattachée à l'Institut des Humanités et Cultures Globales, Institute of the Humanities and Global Culture, aux États-Unis donc, et elle travaille notamment sur l'histoire culturelle et intellectuelle médiévale juive et islamique, en s'intéressant notamment aux textes écrits par des juifs en arabe, et son dernier livre qui vient de paraître s'intitule Jewish Piety in Islamic Jerusalem, The Lamentation Commentary of Salmon ben Yehuim. Et donc aujourd'hui... Pardon ?
Quel est l'éditeur ?
À Oxford, aux universités, Oxford University Press.
Un éditeur légitime.
Et donc du coup, elle va nous parler de To honor one's father and one's mother, Filial Piety in the Hebrew Prince and the Ascetic. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Je tiens à vous remercier, chers collègues, pour cette invitation à réfléchir avec vous sur la transmission des textes de Barlaam et Josaphat dans l'histoire des religions. Cette conférence a été un plaisir d'assister. The Book of the Prince and the Ascetic is an adaptation of the Tales of the Buddha, written in Hebrew by Abraham ibn Chisdai in the 13th century in Barcelona. Ibn Chisdai's Hebrew version is ostensibly a translation of the Arabic versions that circulated widely in the Islamic world. However, Ibn Chisdai's version is exceptional in several respects. First, it has a universal quality. For example, the main characters of the frame narrative, who have proper names in the other versions of the tales, remain anonymous in this version. They are referred to simply as the prince and the ascetic, or Nazarite. The setting and era likewise are generic. Further, even though the text was adapted by a Jewish author for a Jewish audience, the ascetic's teachings cannot be identified with a particular religious tradition. Scholars have observed that the story is, quote, almost devoid of any religious or cultural references, and that, quote, there is no explicit theology, open quoting of the Bible or of rabbinic authorities, no reference to liturgy, nor to other Jewish religious practices. So this is, in your words, this is a religion sans nom, right? I would add that no prophets or religious figures are mentioned, no miracles are reported, and no revelations are introduced. The ethical teachings are imparted through a series of parables in universal terms. Finally, in contrast to other versions in which the prince's spiritual awakening leads him to forfeit his life of wealth and power, in the Hebrew version he remains a prince. These differences are extended through the inclusion of 6 additional chapters, compositions that are unique to Ibn Chisdai's version. One of these original chapters is chapter 29. It appears at the point in the frame narrative when the ascetic takes his final leave of the prince. It is here, at the climax of their relationship, that the ascetic teaches the prince that he is obliged to honor his parents. The ascetic imparts this instruction by reciting verbatim the biblical commandment, known in the Jewish tradition as the 5th of the 10 commandments, which ordains respect for one's father and mother. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land which the Lord your God gives you. The invocation of a biblical commandment in a work with a universal ethical perspective is perplexing, to say the least. This teaching seems incongruous even within the narrative structure of the work. First, the prince of Ibn Chisdai's narrative has no mother. Other versions of the tales of the Buddha mention the prince's mother in passing, often to note that the king's wife has conceived a child, leading the king to consult astrologers about the destiny of that child. But Ibn Chisdai ignores the possibility of a mother throughout the text. There is no conception, no pregnancy, no childbirth, no nursing, no weaning. There is no maternal character, whether affectionate or malevolent, long-lived or short-lived, who appears within the narrative. And I'll just add that I appreciated so much in the talk yesterday of Professor Ducour the wonderful imagery of the mother of the prince expecting her child. Nothing like that for Ibn Chisdai. Thus, it is striking that Ibn Chisdai's ascetic teaches the prince to honor both parents, father and mother, when the prince himself does not seem to have a mother. Second, there is real tension, if not outright conflict, between the prince and his father. The story of the prince's spiritual journey is largely the story of his separation from his father. His spiritual growth is marked by his rejection of his father and everything he stands for. Why should the ascetic command him to honor the father, who represents wealth, power, and material acquisitions, the very antithesis of the virtues of humility, poverty, and spirituality, which the ascetic has encouraged? In order to understand why Ibn Chisdai inserts such a recognizable biblical teaching into the prince and the ascetic, we must consider Jewish discussions of the commandment to honor one's parents. Jewish thinkers, from the rabbis of antiquity to the intellectuals of the Islamic world, have grappled with the questions about the universality of this particular commandment. By reading across the Jewish tradition, it becomes clear that Ibn Chisdai worked against particularist readings of the commandment in order to craft a universal concept of this obligation in which all people can discern through reason the natural obligation of respecting one's parents. Let us begin by examining how the motif of honoring one's parents is treated in chapter 29, a chapter that is entitled "To Honor the Father and Mother and Fear Them, the Obligation to Have Compassion for Them and Serve Them." The scene opens with the prince expressing gratitude for all that the ascetic has taught him. However, the prince's appreciation is overshadowed by his sadness and frustration because his spiritual master is about to leave him. The ascetic insists, over the prince's objections, that the prince must remain with his father. The prince responds, "Truly, my father is my Father who is in heaven. He, God, is the one whom I call Father, and before his throne do I give thanks, and to him do I prostrate myself." There is no doubt that the prince is deliberately misinterpreting the words of the ascetic, but he is also pointing to the ambiguity of the word father, which indeed appears throughout the Jewish tradition in reference to God. Biblical metaphors refer to God as the Father of Israel, and the Jewish tradition builds on this metaphorical association by representing God as Father in prayer and liturgy. Readers might expect the prince's words to please the ascetic. After all, the ascetic has guided the prince to recognize the transcendent deity as the only being who is worthy of obeisance. He has encouraged the prince to fear no human being and to privilege his devotion to God over his loyalty to any human person. Within the narrative, however, the prince's declaration feels more like the lashing out of an impetuous youth than the sincere piety of a committed religious practitioner. The prince dodges the ascetic's demands that he remain in the palace with his father by asserting that his true father is God, who is everywhere, so he should be allowed to follow the ascetic. The ascetic objects strongly when the prince's praise for God leads him to criticize his human father. The prince inverts a verse from Isaiah to tell the ascetic, "The one whom you call my father is not a father for me, as one would think. For his ways are not like my ways, and his thoughts are not like my thoughts." In the biblical context, this verse differentiates God from human beings. The prince, however, uses it to align himself with God in opposition to his father. The ascetic refutes the prince's attempts to interpret father as God and thereby release himself from the obligations of real filial piety. This resistance fits the plot because, in Ibn Chisdai's version, the prince must not leave his post to follow the ascetic and serve God beyond the palace. But it also represents Ibn Chisdai's philosophical outlook. By refusing to allow the prince to substitute devotion to God for his obligations to his father, Ibn Chisdai's ascetic asserts that familial bonds are a rational obligation, not superseded by the demands of religious piety. So this is reason over law. Is the father the teacher? By emphasizing the responsibility of children toward their parents, Ibn Chisdai promotes a rational approach to filial ethics over the revealed teachings of Jewish law and tradition. He rejects the notion that one can transfer the honor owed parents to anyone, either God or, alternatively, to one's teacher. In Jewish rabbinic culture, there is deep tension between parents and teachers and the respective honor due to them. Ibn Chisdai's ascetic implicitly argues against the displacement of parents by sages. As the chapter opens, the prince juxtaposes his love for his teacher, the ascetic, with his love for his father. He dismisses and diminishes his father while he pours affection onto his teacher. He claims that the only thing the ascetic ever did that harmed him, indeed, that frustrated his desires to the point that he despised his life, was when the ascetic prevented him from leaving the palace and following after him. The prince asserts to the ascetic, "It would be good for me to forfeit all my honor and glory, my property and my wealth. I love my lord. I love you." Essentially, the prince's desire is to turn away from his own father and instead follow the ascetic whom he loves. There are certainly filial elements in the master-disciple relationship, which the ascetic implicitly acknowledges by addressing the prince as Bini, my son, throughout the chapter. However, the ascetic rejects the prince's attempts to treat him with the honor that is rightly due to his father. Here again, Ibn Chisdai intervenes in long-standing Jewish debates. The conflict between honoring one's father and one's teacher can be traced back to the Babylonian Talmud. In the words of legal scholar Yeshai Kiel, rabbinic law fosters two complementary ethical categories, which demand personal commitment on the part of their adherents. The traditional ethos of filial piety, which is directed toward the biological parents, and the emerging ethos of rabbinic discipleship underlying the pursuit of Talmud Torah, which is directed toward the master sage. By simultaneously advancing these ethical categories, the rabbi sought to maintain and further the inherited biblical heritage of filial ethics, while at the same time advancing a new system of personal commitment toward the master sage. These two ethical models came into conflict in the Babylonian context, when the master-disciple relationship became more intimate and familial. Disciples would travel great distances to study with a master sage, leaving their family homes for extended periods. This historical reality had legal implications, and the rabbis came to argue that responsibilities toward the sage superseded the obligation of filial piety to one's biological parents. One rabbi, whose words are recorded in the Talmud, anonymously, declared, "The study of Torah is greater than the honoring of the father and the mother." Ibn Chisdai's ascetic rejects this redirection of filial piety as a distortion of the obligation to honor one's parents. In contrast to the rabbinic sages who considered the master-disciple relationship superior to the biological parent-child relationship, Ibn Chisdai's ascetic affirms that the prince's primary responsibility is to his father and his kingdom. He does not accept the prince's extreme affection because it threatens to displace the prince's responsibilities to his own father. Unlike other versions of the tales of the Buddha, Ibn Chisdai's prince ultimately remains a prince in his father's household, the heir to the kingdom. He does not join the ascetic. He does not replace his biological family by joining a brotherhood of mystics or spiritual adepts. Neither does he take on the solitary life of a hermit. He mourns the departure of his teacher, who has taught him much, but he does not forfeit the throne or abandon his father, the king. Neither does he convert to another religion. He has gained wisdom. Perhaps he has achieved an internal spiritual transformation, but he remains in his social and political role. Initially, the prince considers it a spiritual loss to remain in his position. If the ascetic will not permit him to abandon his high station in order to take up the life of an ascetic, he believes, then his spiritual purpose is unfulfilled. As modern scholars who are familiar with other versions in which the prince does abandon his throne in order to pursue a spiritual life beyond society, we may also be surprised at Ibn Chisdai's choice. However, the ascetic encourages the prince to be an example for his father, who may observe his good conduct and repent, thus improving conditions throughout the kingdom. While other versions may present such socio-political goals as an intermediate step, eventually followed by the prince's reunion with the ascetic, for Ibn Chisdai, the prince achieves his spiritual purpose by remaining in society, fulfilling his duties as a prince and a son. Since the prince becomes a model of filial piety, prevented by the ascetic from misdirecting his filial responsibilities toward God or even toward the ascetic himself, we must ask whether he exemplifies an ethic of piety that is traditionally Jewish or universal. The ascetic formulates the ethical principle in biblical language. He quotes precisely from Exodus 20. But within the narrative, neither the prince nor the ascetic are represented as Jewish characters. What does it mean for a non-Jew to exemplify Jewish piety? The aim of our colloquium, or shall I say one of the aims of our colloquium, is to consider the legends of the Buddha in their many permutations and to ask whether and how they conveyed religious teachings. The invocation of the fifth commandment, to honor one's father and one's mother, in the Hebrew adaptation of the tales, suggests that this version indeed conveyed biblical teachings in the Jewish tradition. However, the universalizing tendencies of the narrative force us to grapple with the impact of a biblical commandment in this context. Once again, a consideration of rabbinic literature provides an entry point into the question. The non-Jewish character of Dama ben Netina appears 4 times in the Talmud, always invoked as a model of filial piety. The rabbis are prompted to tell stories about Dama when their disciples ask them, quote, "What are the limits for honoring a father and a mother?" Dama ben Netina's displays of extreme filial piety are dramatic, sometimes comical. In the most oft-repeated story, Dama's respect for his father leads him to miss a lucrative commercial opportunity. Dama possesses valuable merchandise. In some versions, it's a jasper stone needed to replace the lost stone on the breastplate of the high priest. And the rabbis offer to purchase it from him at a high price. Dama agrees to the sale, but he must cancel it when he realizes that the key to the chest where the merchandise is stored is under the pillow of his sleeping father. In some versions, it's under the leg of his sleeping father. Unwilling to wake his father to retrieve the key, Dama loses the sale. He absolutely refuses to wake his father to get the merchandise. Dama justifies his actions as an expression of filial piety. In one version, after his father awakes, Dama asks him rhetorically, "Shall I sell for pennies my father's honor?" The rabbis were well aware of Dama's identity as a non-Jew. In fact, they identify him as Gentile, or more commonly as an idolater from Ashkelon, in every version of the story. It's almost a part of his name. Dama ben Netina, idolater from Ashkelon. Dama provides a precedent for Ibn Chisdai's prince as a non-Jewish exemplar of the commandment to honor one's parents. But the rabbis display some ambivalence about demonstrating exemplary adherence to a Jewish precept through the example of an idolater. One expression of this anxiety comes through a Talmudic comment from Rabbi Hanina. It is reported that 1 year after Dama lost the sale by refusing to wake his father, a red heifer is miraculously born into his herd. Dama realizes that the rabbis would pay an exorbitant amount for the heifer, which is uniquely suitable for Jewish ritual purposes. But instead of inflating the price, Dama sells the heifer for no more than the amount that he forfeited in the previous sale. He explains to the rabbis, "I know of you that even were I to ask from you all the money in the world, you would give it. But I do not ask of you any but that money which I lost for the honor of my father." Rabbi Hanina considers the red heifer to be Dama's reward for honoring his father in the first instance, and explains, if one who is not commanded receives such a reward, all the more so one who is obligated. One who is commanded and fulfills is greater than one who is not commanded and fulfills. Rabbi Hanina's remark distinguishes between a Jew and a non-Jew who perform the same act. Dama may have behaved ethically by honoring his father, but he did not fulfill a commandment, since only Jews are commanded to honor their parents. The same distinction is in effect in the writings of Saadia Gaon, a Jewish scholar of the Islamic world, whose works would certainly have been familiar to Ibn Chisdai. In Saadia's treatise on reward and punishment, he remarks, "Certain good deeds are always rewarded in the world, even when performed by an unbeliever. The first of them is reverence for parents, bir el-walidain, as it is said, honor your father and your mother." Saadia characterizes the act of honoring one's parents as a good deed, hasana, not a commandment, when it is performed by an unbeliever. Non-Jews receive their reward in this world rather than the world to come. It is along these lines that Ibn Chisdai's ascetic insists that the prince must honor his parents, but without coding this obligation as a commandment. He refers to it as a chiyuv, obligation, rather than a mitzvah, commandment. If the prince is not commanded by God through revealed law to observe the precept for honoring his parents, then how would he, or anyone else, come to realize this obligation? Ibn Chisdai's ascetic casts the need to honor one's parents as rational. Honoring one's parents is an expression of gratitude for benefits received. And I think those who are familiar with the Mu'tazilite tradition will see echoes of that in the way that he's setting this up. As such, human beings are capable of discerning the need to honor their parents, even though animals do not understand such a requirement. Ibn Chisdai's ascetic conveys this teaching to his student, the prince, in the following terms. Know, my son, that honoring the father and the mother is precious and more excellent than parents' compassion for their children, because parents' compassion for their children is a natural act, whereas the honor of the son for his parents is an intellectual act, ma'aseh hasechel. It compensates them for a little of their goodness and repays them a small portion of their many kindnesses, their growing weary and their labor for him, and his being nourished by their blood and their milk. Truly, then, the movement of the intellect is more precious and honorable than the movement of nature. This distinction between parents' responsibilities for their children and children's responsibilities for their parents appears also in the Duties of the Heart, a Jewish ethical composition by Bahya ibn Pakuda, who lived in Saragossa the century before Ibn Chisdai. Ibn Pakuda explains, the parent's intention is to benefit himself through the child, for the child is a part of the parent who places great hopes in him. Remark how he gives preference to the child in food, drink, and clothing, how he guards him against all misfortunes, and finds all the pain and trouble involved in safeguarding his peace a trifle, so strongly is his mercy and compassion toward his children impressed on a parent's nature. Nevertheless, both the law and reason oblige the children to obey, honor, and fear their parents, as it is said, honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land which the Lord your God gives you. Both Jewish thinkers, contrast the parental obligation toward children, which is natural, with the children's obligation toward parents, which is dictated both by revealed law and also by reason. The human intellect necessarily grasps the obligation of respecting one's parents. Ibn Chisdai's ascetic presents the duty of honoring one's parents in its biblical formulation, for it is indeed a commandment. But it is not only a commandment. It is also a rational obligation, a basic ethical commitment required of all human beings in recognition of the benefits that each of us have received from our parents. Initially, the inclusion of the biblical commandment seems to indicate a particularly Jewish sensibility. Paradoxically, however, an examination of Ibn Chisdai's Jewish interlocutors, from the ancient rabbinic tradition to medieval Jewish philosophy, makes visible the universalism of Ibn Chisdai's position. He emphasizes filial piety not only as a religious teaching, but even more fundamentally, as an ethical imperative. Thank you.